This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Today, we're diving into one of the most gripping and consequential military stories of World War II, a story of loyalty, leadership, and legacy. In the fate of the generals MacArthur, Wainwright, and the epic battle for the Philippines, best-selling author and former presidential speechwriter Jonathan Horn returns with a powerful dual portrait of two towering and contrasting figures in American military history, General Douglas MacArthur and General Jonathan Wainwright. With fresh access to Wainwright's personal diaries and letters, Horn uncovers the forgotten vow behind MacArthur's famous I shall return and shines new light on one of the war's most harrowing chapters, the fall and eventual liberation of the Philippines. Horn is also the author of Washington's End and The Man Who Would Not Be Washington, and his writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Jonathan, welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the premise of the book, Jonathan. Most people know MacArthur's famous line, I shall return, but few know about Wainwright's vow to stay. What drew you to this forgotten half of the story?
Well, it's exactly that. I think so many Americans have heard those famous three words, I shall return. Douglas MacArthur said those words after being ordered in March 1942 to abandon his army in the Philippines and evacuate to Australia with his family. And that's where he made that famous vow that he would return to the Philippines. But very few people know the story of the general who took command after MacArthur left. His name was General Jonathan Wainwright, as you said, and he also made a vow. And his vow was to stay and share the fate of his men, even when it meant becoming the highest ranking American prisoner of war of World War II. And it seemed to me you couldn't understand Douglas MacArthur and his vow to return to the Philippines unless you understood the story of this lesser known general who had made a vow to stay with his men in the Philippines and share their terrible fate. And then, as you said, I got this big break. I found boxes of Wainwright papers that had been really completely unexplored in two different military archives. And I realized I had this opportunity to be able to tell Wainwright's story in a way never before possible, and to put him where I think he belongs in history, side by side with the legendary Douglas MacArthur.
MacArthur and Wainwright, Jonathan, knew each other from their early days at West Point. How would you describe their relationship before and then during the war?
Right. And so MacArthur was always a towering figure in Wainwright's life. When by the time Wainwright arrived at West Point, MacArthur was in the final year of finishing up what would be one of the most remarkable West Point careers. He would finish first in his class academically and first on the parade ground, too. And so MacArthur was already seen as this towering figure who was unapproachable in some ways. In some ways, the two men have a lot of similarities in their backgrounds. They're both the sons of military officers. They both spent formative years of their life in uh, in military bases in what we would call the West. And but Wainwright took a different path. Wainwright always wanted to become a cavalryman. His father was a cavalry officer. He spent the formative years of his life as a child near the site of Custer's last stand in Montana. And he, from very early on, wanted to learn everything he could about that battle, never knowing that one day he would have to make a last stand of his own in the Philippines, where, of course, Douglas MacArthur would be his commanding officer.
Let's talk about their personalities. In what ways did their personalities and leadership styles differ?
Well, Wainwright really was a fighting general. I think that's a sort of a term that we don't have so much anymore, but he was never comfortable, his men realized, unless he was on the front lines sharing the danger with them every morning when he was on the Bataan Peninsula. What happens is the Japanese attacked the Philippines in 1941, December 1941. American forces will fall back on a stubby piece of land called Bataan, and it's there that Wainwright has control of half the peninsula. And his soldiers very quickly realize he is not at ease unless he is visiting the front lines constantly and he is sharing their dangers. MacArthur, meanwhile, also goes back to a little tadpole-shaped island off the tip of Bataan called Corregidor. And he takes up command in a place called the Malinta Tunnel before being ordered out of the Philippines. And he only makes one visit to Bataan to see the men there who are starving and facing terrible odds. And of course, that will be one of the most controversial parts of his legacy. And the men of Bataan, there are reasons why he may have only made one visit, but the men of Bataan won't forget that. And some of them will call him Dugout Doug for the rest of the war.
The defense of the Philippines was one of the most dramatic and also tragic episodes of World War II. Can you walk us through what happened after Pearl Harbor and how both generals responded?
Right. So after Pearl Harbor, and this is December 8th in the Philippines, that's actually the day that Pearl Harbor happens in the Philippines because of the international dateline. Very quickly, the Japanese will catch the American Air Force. We have some of the best planes in the American arsenal in the Philippines at the time. And it's important to say for your listeners who may not know that the Philippines was actually a colony of the United States. That's an important part of this story. And it was Douglas MacArthur's father, a general named Arthur MacArthur, who had helped bring the Philippines into the American Empire and during the Spanish-American War back in 1898. But very quickly, American strategists had realized that in the event of war with Japan, it would be very difficult to defend the Philippines against the Japanese. And if you look at a map, you can see why. Simply put, the Japanese would be able to bring soldiers and load many soldiers to the Philippines before reinforcements from the United States would be able to cross the world's largest ocean and come to the defense of the Philippines. So American planners settle on this plan called War Plan Orange. And instead of trying to defend the full archipelago, you're just going to try to defend the mouth of Manila Bay. And to do that, you need to control two key positions. One is that stubby peninsula I told you, Bataan, and the other is that tadpole-shaped island off the tip of Bataan in the mouth of Manila Bay called Corregidor. Actually, MacArthur had basically thrown out this plan on the eve of World War II and replaced it with a plan instead to defend the full beaches of the Philippines. But very quickly after the Japanese make their main landing in December 1941, that plan is abandoned and Americans do fall back on War Plan Orange in the retreat to Bataan. And it's General Wainwright who has responsibility for leading troops to Bataan and carrying out this retreat, which is a very complicated maneuver. But when American and Filipino forces, I should say, because these are the United States and Filipino forces all fighting together under the American flag, it's important to say that most of this army was Filipino. By the time they get to Bataan, they find very difficult conditions. Bataan is a very dense, thick jungle where it is very difficult to find the front lines and find where the enemy is. But the enemy is never the main problem in Bataan. It's food shortages. Very quickly, American forces have to go down to half rations and eventually to quarter rations. This is 1,000 calories a day. That's not even enough to live comfortably in bed, to say nothing of trying to fight in foxholes.
Hmm. You write that Wainwright led a heroic but hopeless stand at Bataan and Corregidor. What kept him going under such extreme conditions, especially knowing help was unlikely to come?
Right. And so MacArthur is ordered out of the Philippines in March 1942. And that's when Wainwright is given full command of the Philippines. And he moves his headquarters to Corregidor. And yes, he knows, I think, from the beginning that this is a hopeless mission. And yet his job is to carry out the defense of the Philippines until it is impossible to carry out the defense of the Philippines. And he has to make this decision. And first, Bataan will fall on April 9th, 1942. That is the largest surrender of American forces in history. Nearly 80,000 American forces surrender in Bataan. Wainwright will hold out for another month on the tadpole-shaped island of Corregidor, where he is with a little bit more than 10,000 men inside the Malinta Tunnel. And when he's made this vow, and you can see this in his diary, and this is so important to understanding his story. Of course, MacArthur's vow is splashed across the newspapers, but Wainwright's vow is this vow that he puts on the first page of a new diary that he starts in April 1942, where he says, "No other course of action would be honorable for me, but to stay and share the fate of my men. And I think those words, no other course of action, explains why Wainwright made the decision he did. And it's important to say there were potential ways he could have avoided this fate. His command included the full Philippines. He could have moved his headquarters to one of the southern islands like Mindanao, and from there he could have potentially gotten on a B-17 and escaped to Australia the same way MacArthur had. But he decided that no other course of action would be honorable but to share the fate of his men in that tunnel, and he holds to that vow even when Bataan surrenders and the Japanese bring their big guns to the tip of the Bataan Peninsula and put Corregidor under 24/7 artillery assault. He holds to that vow as the tunnel is shaking and dust is pouring down and they're running out of water. And he holds to that vow even when the Japanese make their final landing on Corregidor and they are approaching the entrance to the Melinta Tunnel. And then he faces this terrible choice whether he is going to surrender to save the lives of his men or potentially try to make a last stand himself. I think MacArthur himself might have been willing to stay and make a last stand and die. But I don't think he would have been willing to do what Wainwright did, and that was to surrender for the sake of his men, even though he knew it would mean becoming a prisoner of the Japanese. And perhaps it's hard for modern listeners to hear, but I think it actually would have been easier for Wainwright to die than to make the choice he did and become a prisoner of war.
You mentioned this big vow in Wainwright's diaries, and you had access to the personal diaries and letters. What else surprised you most about this man in these documents?
Well, I think there's one part of his diary that I come back to, which is in 1945. We hear the words 1945. We think the war is almost over.
No.
Wainwright has become a prisoner. The Japanese have moved him from different prisons, from the Philippines to Taiwan, all the way to Manchuria, where he's facing just completely freezing temperatures and his body is breaking down and he doesn't know whether he's going to live to see the end of the war. He thinks it could last another 2 years. He's cut off from the outside world. He has no idea what's happening. And he thinks he's not going to make it, but he makes this vow on one page of his diary where he says he's going to fight for life just as he fought for life in the Philippines. And no one called him yellow then, and no one's going to call him yellow now.
Mm.
And I think that gives you insight into what kind of man General Wainwright is. And he does end up, of course, living to see the end of the war and being able to return home to a hero's welcome in the United States.
Yeah, and speaking of heroes welcome, both MacArthur and Wainwright received the Medal of Honor, but under very different circumstances. How were these awards received at the time, and what do they say about how we define heroism?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look at MacArthur's Medal of Honor, it really is one of the strangest Medal of Honors ever awarded. He received it after fleeing the danger, essentially, that the Medal of Honor celebrates soldiers for facing. Celebrates is not the right word, because no one in their right mind would want to win the Medal of Honor. Win isn't even the right word. You receive the Medal of Honor for doing something that you could never expect any soldier to willingly do. George Marshall basically admits, he's the Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C., that there are no grounds for presenting MacArthur the Medal of Honor in Australia. It is done as a propaganda move to offset Japanese propaganda about the American commander essentially fleeing the sinking ship. And by the way, in MacArthur's defense, it is important to say he received orders from Franklin Roosevelt to go. But nevertheless, this is not the type of action the Medal of Honor usually celebrates. But what's so interesting though is shortly afterward, after Wainwright surrenders the Philippines, George Marshall proposes also awarding the Medal of Honor to General Wainwright, and he forwards the recommendation to MacArthur. He expects to have no objections to this plan, but MacArthur does have objections, and he essentially says that if Marshall proceeds with this plan to award the Medal of Honor to Wainwright, he's going to come forward with unsavory accusations about Wainwright's character. I think essentially he's implying that he's going to say that Wainwright was an alcoholic. And I think for MacArthur, essentially, the idea of the Medal of Honor going to a soldier who had stayed to see the flag lowered in the Philippines, which was something that MacArthur himself just could not abide to the end. He gave orders to fight on. was unthinkable. But I think it's important to say, as I looked at this story, I think what Wainwright did to stay and to last moment, which was as courageous and above the call of duty as any action performed by any general who raced up a ridge, for example, like as MacArthur's father did during the Civil War, carrying the flag. It was just as hard to stay and see it lowered at that hour of sickening surrender. Um, and so eventually, when Wainwright does return home to the United States in September 1945, Harry Truman is waiting, and he says he finally has the opportunity to present Wainwright the Medal of Honor that he did not receive during the war. And what would it have meant to Wainwright if he had received news in Japanese prisons that he had received the Medal of Honor? Well, I think if you look at his diary, you get a pretty good sense, because all throughout his diary is this concern that Americans won't understand the decision he made to surrender for the sake of his men. And having received the Medal of Honor during the war, if he could have received news of that somehow, I think it would have done a great deal to put his mind at ease.
I want to touch on the writing process a little bit. Jonathan, this is your third historical biography. What was different or especially challenging about writing this one?
Well, this was, I had previously written about the Civil War and about the American founding period. I had never written about the 20th century. And it was my editor at Scribner who actually encouraged me to write about something a little bit more recent. And at first, I wasn't sure how I would feel about it. But as I began to look at this story, I have to say it really did feel like a very long time ago. It's been 80 years this year since the end of World War II. And I think the American character has changed in a lot of ways, not necessarily, I have to say, unfortunately, for the better. Um, and it was also, there's one thing that I find in common with all the experiences I've written about, though, is if you want to write good history, you have to go back and find the papers of the people who lived history and read the words that they wrote. And that was so essential for me, just both from both General Wainwright and General MacArthur, to understanding the decisions they made in this story. And, one thing I think I always like to add when I'm talking about history books is a debt of gratitude that writers like me have to archivists who keep these treasures safe for future generations.
Do you remember the moment in your research process for this book that made you think this has to be told?
Yeah, it was really the moment when I got to see Wainwright's papers. There hadn't been a Wainwright biography in more than 40 years. And these papers had been deposited in these archives in the years after that biography had come out. So no Wainwright biographer had really had a chance to go through them. And so I was just looking at them and I said, well, this story needs to be told. And, it's also, I think, if you look at the fact that MacArthur is still a name remains a household name 80 years after the war. General Wainwright, though very famous at the time, has really slipped into obscurity. We remember the vow of the general who vowed to return, but we've forgotten the vow of the general who vowed to stay and share the fate as part of this really perhaps the greatest military disaster in American history was the defeat in the Philippines. This was American soil at the time. And I thought that story really needed to be told, and that a great historical injustice had been done, and I had the chance to remedy it as I looked at these papers.
What is next for you in your writing?
Good question. I'm still trying to figure that out. You put everything you have into these books, or at least I do, and I admire writers who are able to have multiple books going at once, but not me. I have to now face the task of answering that big question that you just asked. What's next?
Mm. If readers take away just one thing from The Fate of the Generals, what do you hope it is?
Well, first of all, I hope they remember the name General Wainwright and the vow he made, and also to remember the great courage of our prisoners of war, people who have become prisoners of war, and also the great toll that it takes on their families. And that's something you can see in the story of General Wainwright's wife. I would like to say there was a very happy homecoming for General Wainwright all throughout the war. He's looking forward to seeing his wife, Adele, again when he returns home. Unfortunately, when he returns home, he finds out that she's become addicted to alcohol and to painkillers. And ultimately, he has to make the very difficult decision to have her committed. So the great reunion that she would like to see is not necessarily part of the story. And it's a reminder of the sacrifices not only our soldiers make, but also their families make.
He is Jonathan Horn, the author of The Fate of the Generals, MacArthur, Wainwright, and the Epic Battle for the Philippines, available now wherever books are sold. You can learn more about Jonathan and his work and his next project, too. JonathanHornAuthor.com. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Steve Richards. This has been the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thanks for watching.